Recording to the cloud. Recording. Okay.
So Catherine, I wanted to show you what I found the other day in my drawer, back of my drawer. It's the first passport that I got back in 1969. And I was 25 years old, and that was when I left. I took a leave of absence from the Jesuit order after I had finished my master's degree at Boston College. And I got a job working at Billerica High School in December. And that at the end of that first year of teaching at Billerica, I went to Europe. I flew to Europe and I traveled around for 6 weeks. It was quite a while, maybe even 7 weeks. And I stayed at youth hostels. And then I have this, see, it says the American Youth Hostel Pass. And inside it shows all the places, some of the stickers that I got when I was traveling. One of them is Luxembourg, which is where I flew into, and then someplace in Austria and France and Reykjavik, Iceland, which is where the plane stopped on the way over there. So that was a really
In the mountains, could you see the mountain?
well. I rode my motorbike over the Swiss Alps from southern Germany or from Switzerland into Italy, northern Italy.
Wow.
Yeah. It was through a pass. You know, the Goddard Pass is it's high, and they have a switchback paved road, a main interstate highway that goes over through there. But I was able to do that on something like a moped, a small motorbike. And I spent that time just kind of going through different towns and different areas of those countries. I'd stop in a town and find out where the youth hostel is, and then I spend the night there. And in the evening, I'd walk all around the town. And in the morning, I'd spend more time, and then I'd get on my bike and go to where I knew there was another youth hostel.
And what were the youth hostels like?
Well, they're all over Europe. There are hundreds of them in almost every country, and they're like places where you can stay for the night. They're like dorm rooms, so it's a room with maybe 20 bunk beds in it that you can stay there, and then they serve dinner and breakfast, and it's really inexpensive. They're designed to encourage young people to travel, and there was no age. Anyone could stay there, so there's no age restriction. But I think I was 25 years old when I did that, so it wasn't. And
What did it cost to stay in a youth hostel?
about $2. Yeah, it was just a nominal fee, and it's really meant to encourage young people to travel. Let's see where I have a receipt or anything. And they're very safe and very clean. And that at the end of that summer, I worked the second year at Billerica High School. And then that was the last year that I worked there, just the 2 years. And then at the end of that summer, I did something similar. I flew to London and rented another motorbike. And then I just spent 7 weeks riding around southern England, and I went over to Ireland and spent about 3 weeks traveling around Ireland, and stayed in all the youth hostels there. That's when I visited the McDonoughs in Connemara, in the town of Inver. The town was called Inverin, and that's where Walter McDonough grew up. That was Daddy's father, and I visited his brother's son. So our grandfather's brother stayed in Ireland, and his family was living in that same house where our grandfather grew up as a boy. So I stayed with him there for about a week. That was amazing.
They were twin brothers, weren't they?
They might have been.
I think that I've heard that they were twins.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So did you see Walter or his son?
Walter was our grandfather, and Walter's brother, I think, was maybe Matthew or something. And then his son, who would have been Daddy's cousin, his name was Walter, too. So he was named after his uncle, our grandfather. And he was living in that same thatch roof cottage where they grew up. And he had about 6 children with him there. He and his wife, and they had about 6 children. And just that small cottage. One of the things I did when I was staying with them, I went with Walter out onto, he had a donkey cart, and we went up to the peat bog up on the hillside behind the house, where a lot of people dig peat. And so we went up there to pick up some peat to be able, that's like getting firewood. It's what they burned in their fireplace for heat and for cooking. And one day, so we did that one day, and another day we cut the grass. He called it rye. It was like a grain. And so he had one of those large hand scythes that you swing back and forth, and he was mowing it that way. And then he would get a pitchfork and pile it up into a stack, like a haystack. So I spent the day with him doing that. And all the time I was with him while he was working, he would be telling stories. He was just a storyteller. I think that's kind of the tradition there that, Irishmen tell stories. So he was good at that.
Well, that's funny. It's a shame you couldn't record him.
Yeah. And whenever he stopped to tell a story, I guess he stopped to sharpen his scythe. So he'd sit down and he'd get a sharpening stone out, and he'd go back and forth over the long curved blade of the scythe to sharpen it up. Spend about 5 minutes doing that, and then telling a story while he was doing that, and then go back to cutting it.
Did they have farmland?
They called them fields, and they weren't that big. They were maybe 300 feet square, or maybe 500 feet square. And they were all surrounded by stone walls, because all that landscape there was just full of stones. So over time, they kind of picked up all the stones and put them into made walls around each of those fields. And there were dozens of fields like that. So he had he owned some of those fields and grew, I guess, grew some grains in them. I don't know whether it was something they could eat or whether it was probably maybe they could get it milled, or it was just something they fed the cows. They had a couple cows, and they let them graze close to the well, and it contaminated the well, so they couldn't drink the well water, and so they had to bring water in to drink. But it felt like kind of going back 100 years or 200 years in time, visiting them the way they lived.
How far did they have to go to get water?
I don't know. I didn't see them doing that. Maybe they had a neighbor that they could take containers to fill up with.
Can you describe the house, like the rooms, the kitchen?
Yeah. Well, it's that the image of an Irish cottage with the white walls that are it's probably stone with stuccoed over with white stucco, and then the roof of it was thatched hay or some kind of a thatched grain. And then there was a fireplace with a big chimney in the middle off to one side. And it was one main room, and then there were two smaller rooms at either end of the house off of that main room. One was a bedroom and the other one was maybe a room for the kids. So it wasn't that big. And the floor was kind of hardened dirt. And the fireplace, it was a big fireplace that they burned peat in it. And they had these iron hooks that hung down from the stone inside of the fireplace that you would hang a pot on to be able to cook over the fire.
Well, it does sound like Little House on the Prairie.
Yeah. That's a good image.
They didn't have water in the kitchen.
They did have electricity in that house, though, because they weren't far off the main road. And they had a television that they watched.
Well, I'm glad they had at least those things to enjoy.
Yeah.
What did the kitchen look like?
Well, there wasn't a kitchen. There was just that area around the fireplace. Trying to think. It might have been a table in one corner of that larger area.
And they used the fireplace to cook, I guess.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have a bathroom. They had just a place outside where you could pee or poop.
Well, they managed there for a long time.
Yeah, well, that's the way people have lived for thousands of years. So that was a good summer. That was that second summer that I went over to Europe. Those 2 years.
Were they all happy to see you?
Uh, I think they were, yeah. I think it was exciting for them to have someone visit them and stay at their house. Not sure that it was a hardship for them to feed me or to. I know that they put me in the bedroom, which was that was probably Walter and his wife Mary's room. So they put me in there, and they probably slept out in the main room with some of the kids.
Well, that must have been a wonderful experience.
It was. It was just. I felt really connected with Ireland and with our ancestors, and just a good sense of that space. It was right on Galway Bay, overlooking the bay and looking out towards the Aran Islands.
Oh, you could see the bay from their house?
Yeah.
So
Galway.
exciting. How old were the kids when you
The
were?
kids, well, the oldest one maybe was about 15. And then the youngest one was maybe 2 or 3, maybe over 5.
Do you know whether Walter had a job outside of his house and land?
I don't think he did. Well, he didn't do anything. It was summertime, and maybe it was a different schedule, but he could have been disabled or he could have been retired. I'm not sure.
Did he seem disabled?
No, he didn't. He was able to work cutting with the scythe and digging peat. Yeah, that's something like that. I just didn't have a sense of what they all really did.
Well, it must have been an overwhelming input of information, just to see all that.
Yeah, it was. I wasn't there that long, and the kids didn't speak English. They spoke Irish, and his wife didn't speak English. So he and maybe one of the older kids spoke English. So that was a really an interesting experience, just to be connected with that culture in Ireland, where that part of Ireland was one of the few places that still spoke Gaelic.
And was his English clear enough for you to understand?
Yes, yeah, it was. Yeah,
And what was his name?
Walter. He was named after our grandfather, his uncle.
And his father's name was
Maybe Matthew or something.
Matthew.
Yeah. So he was Daddy's cousin.
It's a pretty big difference being in the United States. I mean, they're the same age from the same family.
Yeah.
And the way that they both ended up living
Uh-huh. Yeah.
is amazingly different.
Yeah, it made a big difference. Well, that's why a lot of people from Ireland that emigrated, came to the US. Did I show you my picture and the passport?
No, you didn't. I like that, Martin. You look studious.
Yeah.
And you still have all your hair.
You mean now or then? Photograph. So
Let me see your signature.
it's kind of a weird signature on that picture. You see it up there?
Yes.
Yeah, compared to this signature on the passport. It's not so,
That looks more like your signature.
yeah, that hasn't changed much. Yeah, I still sign my name that way. Get in the habit, you know,
Yeah.
signing it a certain way.
He is reaching up pretty high.
What is?
The D in McDonough is reaching up pretty high as far as
Oh, yeah.
spiritual tendency when your letters go up high above the rest.
Spiritual tendencies. Yeah.
And your H goes up really high.
Yeah.
Excuse me, you were more spiritual than materialistic.
Yeah, well, I had been in the seminary for 6 years. And I had been at, maybe 7 or 8 years after that. I was still on the Jesuit order. Now, 2 years I was on a leave of absence before I officially resigned. Was
So you spent 2 years, 2 summers, I guess, going to Europe.
first summer in 1969, in 1970, I went to Luxembourg, and then I traveled down through Germany and Switzerland and into Italy down to Rome. And then I came back up through France and Belgium and Amsterdam and Holland. And then from Holland back to Luxembourg to fly back.
That is amazing.
And I did that. I did all of that on a little motorcycle.
And how long did that take?
7 weeks. And I spent all that time in youth hostels every night. Different one every night. Yeah.
Wow. And then the following year, you went to Ireland.
Following year, I went to London and rented a motorcycle. And then I traveled down from London down to southern England and across to the west to where I could get a ferry over to Ireland. And I traveled around all of southern Ireland. Then I came back to England and traveled up a little to the north in England and back to London.
I'm surprised that it's just a ferry ride from England to Ireland.
Yeah. Yep. It only takes about an hour. It's not far. Yeah, the ferry goes over to Dublin, which is on the eastern side of Ireland.
That's in Northern Ireland, right?
No, it's in Southern Ireland. Southern Ireland, well, the Irish Republic or Ireland is in the southern part of that big island. Northern Ireland is a smaller section up in the northern part of Ireland, which is a British colony. So it's not part of the Irish country. But they're all Irish.
I wonder whether many Irish immigrated to England when things were really bad.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. I think that it must have been more opportunity in the United States for them to go there, because England isn't that big, and they probably would have had a harder time. But yeah, a lot of Irish did go to England.
And Daddy's father immigrated from Ireland.
Yeah.
And worked on the railroads.
Yeah.
I know it was in West Virginia. I don't know where the railroad went to. But they did.
Well, it was the B&O Railroad. Yeah, the B&O Railroad came through Wilmington.
Yeah, I resumed the recording.
All right.
So,
I wanted to tell you that when we were disconnected just now, how I was thinking about how important it is for me to tell stories and how hard it's been over the years to kind of relate to people what I've done in my life. And I really appreciate your being interested in that. And it's a kind of an incentive for me to kind of go deeper into my memory and to my feelings to begin to share some of those stories in my life. So I appreciate having you listen to them. And also I was thinking how we had been talking about Walter, Daddy's cousin in Ireland, and how he was telling me a lot of stories when we were working in the field during my visit with him, cutting the hay, and how he would just, it was so easy for him to tell stories, and that was true for a lot of the Irish culture is like that. They're all storytellers. So I feel like it's important for me to begin to be more expressive of myself and remembering and putting into words things that I've done.
do you remember any of the stories?
No, not at all.
How many days did you stay at their cottage?
About 4 days. 4 nights, maybe.
Sounds like a nice visit.
It was. It was really important. It kind of felt like I was welcomed into Ireland and into that McDonough family.
Yeah.
Just and I have a good sense of where I've come from, what my roots are.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting what you said about the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's part of the Irish culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the sarcasm and the irony and the humor and the playfulness and the imagination.
Yeah. It would be good to hear, how he told stories, to hear all those different things that you just
Yeah.
said.
Yeah. Well, you could, on YouTube, you could just Google old Irish storytellers and you'll get a lot of historic recordings of, old Irishmen telling stories.
Mhm.
And that's what they all did. So it was just part of their culture. It was
Uh-huh.
very, very common. That would be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah.
I spent about a year just reading Irish stories, short stories. I really enjoyed them.
When did you do that? When you were traveling?
No, recently, maybe about 5 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, Catherine, I want to do a painting now. Are you getting a good enough video that
Yeah,
it's worth
stop this recording.
what did you say?
I'm going to stop this recording.
Yeah. Okay.